Big 12 open for business.
They love their Cougars.
You know, Mitch.
Thank you, ESPN.
Welcome on into the Cougar Tracks podcast, powered by KSLSports.com. I am your BYU insider, Mitch Harper. It's rivalry eve. BYU and Utah laying this down on a Friday. Getting you ready for the big showdown between the Cougs and the Utes. Number 9 BYU versus 4-4 Utah. 8:15 kick on ESPN. Extended pregame coverage begins at 6 on KSL News Radio. Myself, Matt Baiamonte. We'll get things started from Salt Lake and get you ready for the Cougs and the Utes. It's a special meeting as BYU and Utah are meeting for the first time as Big 12 foes. It's the 96th meeting all-time between the programs. And in this edition of the podcast, going to be breaking down what I believe are the keys to victory for BYU football against Utah. You can follow me on X and Instagram at Mitch_Harper. Follow KSL Sports as well at KSL Sports on all the socials, and we'll go in that direction. So here are my keys to victory for BYU football against the Utah Utes. And keep in mind, BYU comes into this game as a 3-point favorite against Utah. BYU's number 9 in the college football playoff top 25, number 9 in the AP and the coaches poll as well. BYU is the better football team than Utah. They just are. They are playing complementary football in all three phases. And BYU, this is an opportunity to decisively beat Utah in an impressive fashion. And I think, you want to win the game no matter what. But this is a chance to really put your foot down on the gas and stomp Utah when they're down. Because Utah under Kyle Whittingham hasn't been down like this in quite some time. You'd probably have to go back to 2012, 2013 when they were having some losing records. But even then, the saving grace was, well, we're building up in the Pac-12. You probably have to go back to 2007 when they hit completely rock bottom. I think they lost to Wyoming, and then they lost to UNLV 27-0, Frank Summers. That's probably the last time Utah was down and out like this. And if you were to beat them soundly and not need some late-game heroics that comes down to the final horn, I just think that would be a clear message to the state, to local recruits. There is a shift happening, and BYU is the top dog now. Because I still think going into this matchup, not many people really remember that BYU was the winner in that last meeting. I don't think that's much of a talking point. And granted, not many players are carryovers from that game. After 3 years in the transfer portal era, in the NIL era, that is a lifetime ago. There's so much roster movement between then and now. But that's what's in front of BYU. Beyond just simply playoff and Big 12 championship, a real chance to just make a clear statement in state that when Utah's down and out and when BYU's rolling, it doesn't bode well for the Utes. And I think that would be a huge deal if BYU could do that. Will they? We'll see. I would probably bet that it's going to end up being closer. But, hey, BYU has proven everyone wrong at every turn this season. And to me, key number one for the Cougs, and they've been really good at this season, a fast start. BYU, I think Greg Wrubell had this stat, they've won their last 11 games when scoring first. Kalani Sitake teams have been excellent this year. And really, historically, they've been pretty good and starting strong. I think that's going to be key in this one because the morale, the psyche of Utah coming into this one, there's so many questions. Utah doesn't hang their hat on much right now coming into this game. And if you jump on them early, it just kind of kills the belief, the intensity in the crowd when they're trying to dig themselves out of a hole rather than jumping on you and you got to fight back. BYU's capable of bouncing back. We've seen BYU face adversity in stretches this year. Not often. They haven't been a team that trails very often, if at all. But still, they can, and they can come back and work their way back. But You don't want to allow that to Utah because you give an underdog belief like you did last month against Oklahoma State. That becomes a lot trickier than you expect. So I think a fast start is critical for BYU. You know that if they win the coin toss, they're going to kick. That's what Kalani Sitake does. It's almost like it's an ode to Lavelle Edwards. That's what Lavelle always did. BYU will kick the ball. They'll never receive. But when they do get the ball, or when the defense takes the field, get a quick 3-and-out, maybe a turnover. Brandon Rose probably going to be the quarterback I would expect for Utah in this matchup, which is very interesting because I do believe Isaac Wilson's still got a lot of potential, but he has played poorly, to put it lightly, this season. And to ignite some sort of spark maybe for Utah, maybe Brandon Rose can provide that. BYU can't have catastrophic turnovers. In the game 3 years ago, BYU only had one turnover. One. But they didn't lose the turnover margin. BYU in games against Utah, and I laid it out in the historical look at the rivalry, so many games where they're just coughing up the football. Like, and BYU, they're not this team that has to have this just small margin for error. No, like BYU's good. I mean, this is a top 10 football team. They've got the ability where if they do cough it up, they'll be okay. They can bounce back. But I guess if you go deeper into the turnover conversation, don't give up a pick six. Don't give up a scoop and score. Okay, you throw a pick inside your own territory. That's not ideal, but don't give up points when the defense takes the field. I mean, they've been put in those spots like SMU where they're put in a disastrous situation and they get a goal line stand and they force a takeaway. Don't give up points to Utah's defense. You can't do that. No catastrophic turnovers, and I think you're going to be okay. I'm optimistic BYU's defense will get a takeaway or two, and that's going to be key as well because traditionally in these Utah games, even in the 2021 game, BYU only had one takeaway against Utah. It was the Chaz Ayu pick. They've got to be able to generate some takeaways on this Utah offense that is one of the worst in college football this season. Utah hasn't scored more than 20 points since the Oklahoma State game in September. You've got to pounce on them and create short fields for BYU because we've seen when that happens, the onslaught, BYU will capitalize, and it'll be a blue wave on the Utes. I think another key for BYU is establish the ground game early and often. BYU's rushing offense comes into this one 168.5 yards per game. Utah's rush defense only allowing 134 on the ground. Utah's got a good defensive front, and they should be relatively healthy in this game. Junior Tafuna, Connor O'Toole, Karenni Reed, all these guys are going to be, pretty dialed in for Utah. They're going to be ready to go. And you know what? I like that too. I like that component here in the game, that by most accounts, these players, these rosters are pretty fully staffed. There's not this key injury. Yes, the Cam Rising thing is there, but Cam Rising's been missing in action for 2 years now. That's nothing new to Utah. Seeing him in action was a bigger surprise than actually not having him. Utah has grown accustomed to life without Cam Rising. But they have had key defensive personnel in stretches this season out. And it seems like they're getting relatively healthy by kind of looking at this game and getting ready for it. So BYU has to be prepared. Utah's defensive line, Connor O'Toole, Junior Tafuna, Keanu Tanavasa, he's been banged up as well, and then Logan Fano and Van Fillinger. You know this game's going to mean a lot to Logan Fano. Once a BYU signee, I remember when he was at BYU that 1 year, I think it was practice number 3 in spring ball. He suffers an ACL. After 2 practices, he was the first-team defensive end. He was an absolute stud, and he leaves BYU. His brother ends up signing with Utah. Logan's going to want this one. BYU has got to be able to dominate in the trenches. The offensive line has been really good this year for BYU. And no Connor Pay, that's okay. Bruce Mitchell will be ready for the task at center. Waylon Lapuaho, Austin Leausa, that crew has done a really nice job the past month in replace of pay and kind of reshuffling the deck a bit. Mocassini was dealing with an injury, and Leia Usa and Bruce Mitchell have kind of ran away and taken over that job. Braden Keim, Caleb Etienne, Waylon Lapointe, they have got to be their best versions of themselves for a full 4 quarters against Utah, because Utah's defense is confident they can generate havoc. They haven't done it as much this season. BYU and Utah, pretty much the same numbers in terms of sacks coming into this one. About 14, 13, somewhere in there. These two have not generated much sacks lately. BYU started out the season really strong. I think there's going to be a desire to get home and finish the job a little bit more in this one. And Utah has not created as much havoc as they have had in years past. Utah down a full percentage point from last year. Last year they were at 18% havoc. This year they're at 17% havoc rate. And 2 years ago they were at 19% havoc rate. So the numbers in terms of havoc have been trending backwards for Utah, whereas BYU, they have been trending up this year. This is a much improved BYU defense. Coming into this game, BYU defensively 146.5 yards allowed in rushing defense, but BYU's pass defense has been excellent. Utah's been really good too, only allowing 169.5, but some of that has been factored into teams just kind of kept it on the ground. Kind of killed the clock in stretches because there's been no threat from Utah's offense in many of these games. But BYU's pass defense, one of the better ones in the Big 12, and I think that bodes well for a Utah team that's searching for answers offensively. If they do end up going with Brandon Rose, which again seems to be where all the signs are pointing to, how often do they turn to him on the ground? And I asked Jay Hill how much improvement he's seen in stopping quarterback run game, and he feels good about that. I mean, he kind of didn't know how to answer that, but I think that's going to be a piece here to this game. Utah's going to want to turn to Brandon Rose's feet and let him loose and run the football, because he's not the greatest threat through the air. And with BYU's secondary, with Jacob Robinson, Mark Collins, Tanner Wall, Crew Wakely, Evan Johnson, who's been coming on, this crew's not going to give up much. And Utah's wide receiver units in flux, No Money Parks. There's been a lot of rumors about which personnel is going to be available with their wide receiver unit going into this matchup. I just don't see much through the air for Utah. So Brandon Rose's feet is going to be critical, and that's, again, where BYU's defense has got to get home and be able to stop him there. And for BYU offensively, they've got to turn to L.J. Martin. And I want to see him get the rock early in the game. That first offensive series, set the tone like you did at SMU, like you did at UCF. Give him 2 or 3 carries and get that first down of the game. He has become a special player for BYU. These last 2 games are not a fluke. L.J. Martin's going to continue to only get better from here. He is such a quiet, meek, humble kid, but man, he is a big-time talent, and I think he's just kind of growing into his identity within this offense and becoming a star player for the Cougars. So I want to see him have success. BYU teams in the past against Utah in Salt Lake, it's been a mixed bag. I do look back at the numbers, and a little bit better than you'd want to get, maybe say how it felt. 153 on the ground for BYU in their last visit to Rice Eccles in 2018. 2016 had 146 on the ground. That was disappointing because you consider you had Taysom, you had Jamal. That was an underwhelming performance there. 2012, only 106 on the ground. 2010 wasn't much. 2008, Harvey had success. 2006, mixed bag. Curtis Brown got stonewalled at times. It's been difficult to run on Kyle Whittingham coached Utah team defenses. And Witt's obviously been there for a quarter century, so it even dates back further than, 05, 06. But just kind of focusing on that time frame since Witt's been the head coach, it has been a task to run the football, particularly in Salt Lake, on Kyle Whittingham teams. So I think that's going to be huge for BYU to be able to have success. And I think what also bodes well, too, is that if LJ does need a breather, and he's got to be the guy that gets 20, 22 carries in this game, in my opinion. But if he needs a breather, Hinckley's ready to go. Sione Aimo is there, too. Got the full stable of running backs. Enoch Nawahine expected back as well. BYU should be fully loaded personnel-wise at the running back position, and that's a good thing for the Cougs because you've got to have them all. We've seen in this series, think back to 2018, they had to turn to Matt Hadley. They had to turn deep into their bench to get rushing yards. So they've got to be ready for anything from Utah. And I think that's another area that I'm very curious about. What new looks does Utah throw at BYU? And vice versa. BYU might throw some new wrinkles too, but BYU knows who they are. They're not in a do-or-die spot. What they've been doing has been working at a high level. It's just continuing to execute at the highest of levels like they've been doing already. Utah, similar spot to Oklahoma State. Last month when they traveled to Provo, they threw some new wrinkles at BYU, and it caught BYU a little bit off guard. Is BYU going to be better equipped to handle those new wrinkles that Utah might throw? And I think what does help in this game is that you have Jay Hill, you have Sione Buha, Gary Anderson, guys that understand how Kyle Whittingham views and approaches this game. And they understand how Morgan Scalley thinks. They understand the DNA, and Kalani does too. But those guys more recently, and I just think that's going to be a huge deal for BYU in the preparation for this game. I mean, Gary Anderson's contributions, he's kind of unofficially viewed as a consultant. He's not on the official staff, but he's influential in this program. The work that he's done with the defensive line and the defense as a whole, it's significant. And he works with Jay Hill and Sione Buha and Kelly Papinga. I mean, these guys have this defense dialed in, and I think they've got to have one of their best games to date because you just got to get out of this. And again, you got a chance here to really make a statement if you can win big against Utah on Saturday night. And I think finally my last key to victory is just kind of physically overwhelm Utah in the trenches. It was an underrated piece to the win 3 years ago, but BYU was the far more physical football team. And it rang true in that game, and it showed up in a big way as BYU took home its first rivalry win in 12 years at the time. Physicality is of the utmost importance in BYU versus Utah. During that 9-game losing streak, Utah had the decisive edge in the trenches against BYU. To the point where even guys like Kelly Papinga, who are on the staff now, when they were at BYU before, they acknowledged that was the difference. BYU was losing in the trenches consistently to Utah. BYU has to overwhelm the Utes. And I'm curious to see what Utah's offensive line, how they perform against BYU's defensive front. I really thought Utah's O-line was going to be one of the better offensive line units in the Big 12 this year. I don't think they've lived up to expectations. I think the tackles are solid with Lomu and Spencer Fano, but the interior there's opportunities to create, pressures through that group. And can BYU just overwhelm them and have their heads spinning and not know how to attack? I mean, Jay Hill is going to have some exotic looks dialed up for this game. You just know. And it's got to be a weird dynamic for Jay Hill going into this game because, let's face it, Jay Hill was a Utah man. Played for the Utes, coached the Utes. I mean, it's alma mater. But as we know, in this industry, when you're getting your paycheck and an employer's writing your checks and you put your blood, sweat, and tears for the guys that are playing for you, those allegiances go out the door. And you want to get that win badly. But to have that chance, you want to make a statement. And I think that would be a big statement if BYU just overwhelms Utah in the trenches. And if they do that, they're going to win, period. Even if there's some, situations where BYU, struggles offensively, if you're overwhelming them in the trenches, you're going to win this football game, point blank. And I think that's going to be a huge key for BYU. But it's going to be a fun one. 8:15 kick, BYU and Utah. Some other stats that kind of catch my attention. BYU comes into this game averaging 35 points per game. Utah, 22.8. Scoring defense, BYU's allowing 19 points per game. Utah allowing 16.5 points per game. If this is a game that's around 17-13. That bodes well for Utah. BYU gets this thing up to 24. Cougs are going to take this one, and they might run away with this thing. Because I just don't think Utah's got much offense to score more than 21. I'd be stunned if they scored more than 21. I just really would. I think it's got to be that 16-13, 17-14, somewhere in there for Utah to potentially win this game. Total offense, BYU averaging 410 per game, Utah 375.9. Total defense, BYU allowing 331.5, 303.5 total defense for Utah. And again, that's counting the whole season, not just Big 12 play. Kickoff return, BYU, much more explosive in the return game than Utah. 22 yards per kickoff return, 14.6 in punt return. Utah only 17.3 in kickoff return, 3.8 in punt return. And I think that's kind of an underrated piece here with Utah is that they used to always win the day on that third phase. You don't really hear that much with Utah on the special teams side of things. But we know in these rivalry games, special teams do show up. Penalties pretty much the same. Both teams around 39 yards per game in penalties. Net punting about the same, 39.6 for BYU, 39.7 for Utah. There's some stats here that look really even. And I think that's one of the reasons if you just kind of look at the numbers and crunch it and you forecast the look ahead for what these teams could be going forward, it makes a lot of sense why the line is only about 3 points right now. A lot of the prognosticators don't believe in BYU. Utah's at home, rivalry game coming off a bye week. But again, BYU's the much better football team. And this is an opportunity for Jake Retzloff, too, who we haven't talked much about in this podcast. And I think that's a credit to just the BYU team at large, how it's a complimentary effort. But this is a chance for him to define his legacy at BYU. Anyone that maybe still somehow, some way is not believing in that guy, and I don't know how you could be at this point. And I know that he's not perfect by any means. This is not Zach Wilson in 2020. This is not, Taysom Hill, Jim McMahon, Steve Young. But the guy is winning. And so you got to love that. But you will even win the most critical BYU fans of Jake. He will win them over if he wins against Utah. That's what this game means. That's what it means to people. And I believe wholeheartedly that special BYU seasons do not include a loss to Utah. You can't have a special season at BYU without a win over Utah. Now, maybe if you lost this game, you still won out, got to the Big 12 title, and won that game. It's pretty special. But, man, it would still be like, how did you lose to Utah? How did you lose that game? There would still be this how'd that happen? You can't do that. No one ever talks about the 1994 season. BYU had a top 25 team. They beat Oklahoma in a bowl game. 30th anniversary. Has anyone honored that team? No. They lost to Utah. BYU in 2008. Do you ever talk about that season? No. You talk about it, the failures. Quest for perfection. They lost. They lost to Utah, 5 picks. No, it wasn't a special season. Do you talk about 09? Yes. 07? Yes. 06? Absolutely. 1983? Yes. 84? Yes. 79? Yes. 2001? Yes. You beat Utah. Even in the years where you lose a bowl game in 01. But you beat Utah. You won a Mountain West title. Special seasons at BYU are tethered to beating Utah. And that's the challenge in front of this team. And it's a tricky spot, too, on the schedule because you've still got games ahead. And you got to escape this one healthy on the injury front. You don't want to suffer any personnel losses because I do believe there will be some sort of hangover effect the following week against Kansas. Kansas has been playing some better football as of late. They're only a 3-point underdog against Iowa State at home in their game against the Cyclones. So that's going to be a tough game next week in Provo, especially coming on the heels, win or lose against Utah. So you got to get this one done. And I'm going to say BYU does get it done. I'm going to say the Cougs, 24, Utah 17. It sounds too clean. Honestly, just saying that out loud, it sounds too clean for what a Utah-BYU game should be. And I say that I'm forecasting maybe a missed extra point, maybe a couple field goals, handful of field goals maybe. It's a little too clean to just say 24-17. Kind of an interesting thing. It has no bearing on this game. But I was looking at BYU's history as a top 10 team against Utah. This is the 7th time it's happened. BYU in the previous 6, they're 6-0. 2001, number 8 in the country, they won 24-21. 96, they were number 8, 37-17. 1990, 45-22. 1984, 24-14. 1983, 55-7. 1979, 27-0. Pretty much blowouts outside of 2001. The 84 game is kind of what I'm kind of forecasting here. Similar type of vibe, about 7 to 10 point victory, and BYU gets in and out with their day. Could it be 96 like? We'll see. I mean, if that happened, Cougar fans will just be celebrating. It'll be an all-time high to be getting a 20-point beatdown on Utah at their place. That'd be something special. But I'll keep it modest. 24-17. Cougs get it done by a touchdown and move on to 9-0. But we'll have to find out. 8:15, it plays out. Saturday night, extended pregame, 6 o'clock on KSL News Radio. I cannot wait. My first time as a media member covering BYU Utah in Salt Lake. Had chances in 2016 and 18, but I was not able to attend the game due to some other commitments with some of my radio responsibilities at previous outlets back then. So cannot wait. It's going to be a lot of fun. And, hey, we'll be at Roland Hall, too, on Saturday afternoon, noon to 3. Myself and Matt Baiamonte will be doing a pregame Cougar Sports Saturday, getting you way early pregame, getting you ready for the game day events. We'll have a tailgate party at KSL Sports. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Swing on by noon to 3 for Cougar Sports Saturday. So I'll talk to you then here on the Cougar Tracks podcast, KSLSports.com, KSL News Radio, and download the KSL Sports app today.